The new under-housekeeper flinched when the library door latched behind her, and the Duke of Quenby, who had sat 9 years on the county bench and knew exactly what that flinch meant, put down his pen. "Forgive me," Ranulph said, and crossed the room, and opened the door again, and left it standing wide. She thanked him for the draught of air, which was a lie so graceful that he let her have it. Her name, she said, was Miss Reed. She had come to Quenby 6 weeks before with a written character from a clergyman in a northern parish, and she was the best servant in the house and the strangest. She could keep an inventory that balanced to the penny. She knew the still-room work and the linen and the ordering of a great household as though she had been raised to it, which no under-housekeeper of 26 ought to have been, and she counted doors. He noticed it in the 4th week and could not stop noticing it after. She never entered a room without her eyes going first to the way out of it. She would not work in the plate closet, which had 1 door and no window, and had contrived, without ever once refusing, to be needed elsewhere every time she was sent there. She wore her sleeves buttoned to the knuckle in July. She ate alone. When the footman laughed suddenly in the passage, she stood very still until the laughing stopped. Ranulph had a reputation in 3 counties for being a hard man to sit in front of. He had earned it. He had also, in 9 years of committals and coroner's business, learned to read the small print of what has been done to people, and he read it in this woman the way another man reads a bill of costs. In August he had the library catalogued, because the second Duke's collection had never been listed and the damp was getting into the east wall, and he asked whether any of the upper servants wrote a fair hand. "Miss Reed does, Your Grace," said Mrs. Kemp. "She wrote a beautiful hand." She wrote a lady's hand, taught by a master, with the long-tailed G of an expensive schoolroom, and on the 4th day of the work he came in quietly and found her at the long table with a monument inscription copied out before her and a pencil in her fingers. And she had corrected the Latin in the margin. She saw him see it. She put the pencil down and stood up and said that it had been presumption and she would recopy the page. "Was I wrong," said Ranulph, "or was the mason?" A pause. "The mason, Your Grace." "Then leave it stand." He took up the sheet and looked at it and did not look at her. "Where were you taught?" "At home," she said, "before I was not," and the sentence closed like a gate, and he did not push it. The advertisement was in the 2nd column of a London paper 11 days later, and he read it 3 times over his breakfast while his coffee went cold. It offered 5 guineas for information concerning a young woman of 25, brown-haired, well-spoken, of unsound mind and dangerous to herself, who had absconded in April from a licensed house at Fenhollow, and it desired that she be detained and word sent, at the charge of her guardian and nearest relation, Sir Julius Farren of Marle Hall. Underneath, in the smaller type, it named her, Miss Alethea Sayer, sole heiress of the late Mr. Anthony Sayer of Sayer's Cross. The description of her hair was wrong. Everything else was exact. Ranulph folded the paper and put it in his coat and did not send for her. He went instead to his study and sat for 2 hours with the door open, and thought about a woman who counted doors, and about the phrase at the charge of her guardian, and about what it costs in fees and in signatures, to have a person put away and kept away for the better part of a year. He sent for her at 4 in the afternoon, in the full light in the garden room, and he had the glass doors to the terrace standing open before she came. "Sit down if you will," he said. "You are not in any difficulty. You may leave whenever you like, and the door is behind you and open, and nobody in this house will stand in it." She sat on the edge of the chair with her back very straight. He laid the folded paper on the table between them, unopened, and put his hand flat upon it. "I am not going to read this to you," he said. "I know what it says. I know what such things generally are. I have signed committals in my time, and I have learned, rather too slowly, how many of them are somebody's convenience wearing a doctor's coat." He looked at her then, properly. "You are safe in this house today, and you will be safe in it tomorrow, and that does not depend upon your answering me. But I am going to ask you one question, and you may refuse it." Her hands were locked together in her lap. He could see the pulse going in her throat. "Who hurt you?" said the Duke of Quenby very quietly. She did not answer for a long time. A blackbird went on in the yew hedge outside as though nothing at all were happening. Then she told him. She told it flatly and in order, the way a person tells a thing they have rehearsed alone at night for a year so as to be believed. Her father dead of a fever in the spring 3 years past. A codicil produced afterwards by his man of business, Sir Julius Farren, who had married her aunt. A codicil in a hand very like her father's, making Farren her guardian and trustee, until she should marry with his consent. Her refusal of the marriage he proposed was to his own nephew. The physicians, 2 of them, who saw her for a total of 70 minutes and were paid 4 guineas each. The house at Fenhollow, which was licensed and respectable and had a high wall and a locked yard, 11 months. The letters she wrote, which she now understood had never gone. The keeper's wife, whose name she would not give even now, who left the yard gate on the latch one April morning and turned her back, she said none of the worst of it. He understood that she was leaving it out, and that she was leaving it out for his sake as much as her own, and it was the most terrible courtesy he had ever been shown. When she had finished she said, "You will want me to go, Your Grace. There is a reward, and there will be talk, and Quenby cannot have it." "Miss Sayer," said Ranulph, and watched her hear her own name spoken aloud for the first time in a year and a half, and watched what it did to her face. "What is it you want? Not what you think you may have, what you want." She was crying by then, without any sound, and furious with herself for it. "My name," she said. "I should like my name back." The Duke of Quenby went to his desk at 11 o'clock that night, and he did not go to bed at all. He wrote 9 letters before the clock struck 1, and 14 more before the window went grey, to Mr. Giver, his solicitor, to come down by the first coach and bring a clerk and a commissioner for oaths. To the incumbent of the parish of Sayers Cross, requiring an examined copy of every entry, register and vestry minute touching the Sayer family for 30 years, and the churchwarden's account of what plate or paper was kept in the parish chest. To the commissioners in lunacy, in his own hand and over his own name and style, requesting the inspection book of the licensed house at Fenhollow, and the names of every physician who had signed a certificate there in 4 years. To the secretary of the Lord Chancellor, who had dined at Quenby twice. To Lord Bexhill, who owed him a favour of the sort that is never spoken of and never forgotten. To the clerk of the peace for 2 counties. To the editors of 3 newspapers, in careful, cold, actionable English. To a dying attorney's clerk named Pallow at Hull, who had witnessed a will at Sayers Cross in the spring of the year in question and might yet be found alive. His cousin Marcus came down at the end of the week, having heard something, and offered in the hall to go and call Sir Julius Farren out. "No," said Ranulph, "he is a coward. He would not stand. That is precisely the trouble." Ranulph did not raise his voice. "If I shoot him, he becomes a man who was murdered by a duke, and she becomes forever the madwoman it was done over. There is not a drawing-room in England that would say otherwise. No, he will be undone with paper in daylight, by men in wigs, and every step of it will be printed, and when it is finished nobody will be able to say a kind word for him at any table in the kingdom without being laughed at. That will last. A bullet lasts a morning." Marcus said after a moment that he had never been so glad to be a poor relation. By dawn on the 2nd day the mails had gone out on 4 roads, and by the end of the month all England knew what the Duke of Quenby thought about Fenhollow, because it was in the papers over his name, and what England learned after that came slowly and did not stop. The parish chest at Sayers Cross held a churchwarden's copy of the true will, entered and dated 8 months before the codicil that was supposed to have preceded it. Mr. Pallow was found alive at Hull and swore an affidavit from his bed with 2 witnesses and a commissioner present, and died in November, and his 3 pages did more damage than any duel ever fought in England. The inspection book at Fenhollow was produced under order, and showed that the visiting commissioners had been kept from the north wing on 4 separate occasions. The licence was revoked at the quarter sessions in February. Both physicians were struck from the college rolls, one of them having signed 11 certificates in a single afternoon. Sir Julius Farren was removed from the Commission of the Peace in March, indicted for forgery in May, found guilty upon the 2nd count, and did not live in England afterwards. Chancery restored Sayers Cross and the funds to Miss Alethea Sayer, with an account of the rents for 3 years, in the autumn. Ranulph attended none of it that he could avoid. He went where he was needed and gave evidence in a flat voice and came home the same night, because there was work at Quenby that mattered more. She had the key to her own door from the first evening, and he had told her, standing in the passage with his hands behind his back, that no lock in the house was ever turned from the outside, and that the housekeeper's keys hung on a nail by the kitchen stair where anybody might take them. He had the plate closet fitted with a second door into the passage. He had the terrace glass left open in all weather that permitted it, and in the weather that did not, he opened it anyway and put a screen by her chair. He never once touched her without asking, and for a long while he did not ask. She stayed on as Miss Sayer, a guest, and refused an allowance and kept the household books anyway, because she said idleness was worse than anything, and Mrs. Kemp, who had guessed the whole of it in a week, called her ma'am and made no fuss about it. Ranulph watched a woman come back into a body one small degree at a time. She ate at the table in October. She slept through a night in November and came down astonished by it. Her hair, which had been cut off at Fenhollow and had grown out in an uneven crop she kept covered, was long enough by the spring to be pinned, and the morning she came down without a cap he had to look at his plate. She began to play the pianoforte again in December, badly at first, furious at her own hands, and he took to doing his letters in the next room with both doors open so that she would know she was heard and not watched. He said nothing to her of what he felt for the whole of that year, and the reason was simple and he knew it perfectly well. She had come to him with nothing, and he had given her back a name and a fortune, and a woman in that position who is offered a duke's hand has no honest way to say no. He would not do it. He had seen what a guardian's convenience looks like from the inside now, and he would sooner have gone to his grave alone. It was Alethea who ended it, in the garden, on a bright cold morning in April, exactly 2 years after a keeper's wife had left a gate on the latch. "You are going to let me leave," she said, "aren't you? You have a house of your own to go to, and rents and a steward wanting orders." "That is not an answer, your grace." Ranulph looked at the yew hedge and found he could not manage it there, and so he said it to the hedge. "If I ask you now, you cannot refuse me. Not really. Everyone would tell you it was owed. I have been a magistrate too long to pretend I do not know what that is. It is the same instrument. It is only pointed the other way." There was a silence, and then she came round in front of him so that he had to look at her. "Then I shall ask you," said Alethea Sayer, "and you may refuse me, and the door is behind you and open, and nobody in this house will stand in it." He laughed, which he had not done in about a year, and then he found he could not see very well. "I have loved you," he said, "since the afternoon you corrected a mason's Latin and stood up expecting to be dismissed for it. Not since the paper. Before the paper. I want that on the record." "It is on the record," she said. They were married at Sayers Cross in June, in her father's church, with the churchwarden who had kept the parish chest standing up in the second pew and weeping into his hat. She walked in on the arm of Mr. Giver, who had asked for the honour and had to be talked out of bringing the affidavit with him. The Duke of Quenby kept 2 habits to the end of his life, and his household knew better than to correct either. He never allowed a door in any house of his to be locked from the outside. And every morning of 31 years he came down first and opened the terrace glass himself, in all weathers, before his wife came into breakfast, so that when Alethea entered the room the way out was already standing wide, and she never once in all that time had to look for it.